have everybody introduce themselves first and just talk about why they're equipped to discuss.
Hello, I'm Finlay Johnson. I'm the CEO for the Association for Electronic Music.
Hi, I'm Aurelia Ortiz, and I'm the founder and director of Encode Talent, which is a boutique agency for management and booking.
Okay, and we know who Mark is. I'm Katie Bain from Billboard Dance. And so I think the place to start is, obviously this is your, fourth year doing this report. I'm curious what you see as the most striking changes from 2025. What stands out to you in that respect?
Well, it's sort of that there isn't a striking change. It's more the same, which is both good, but also when things are going well, that's the time when you think about what should we be building next, not when things aren't going well. So I would take this as great. Things are carrying on. Hopefully 26 is going to be more the same. But there are loads of, I wouldn't say flashing red indicators. It's like there are amber lights flashing up on the dashboard. You know, the thing about fewer tickets being sold, but more revenue being generated, fragmentation, you know, all those, the rise of AI, consumers leaning into creation, all those sort of things. What are and the rise of the global south, what are the things that we can be doing now to embrace and get ahead of those?
Yeah, I was really fascinated by what you said about just everything becoming more expensive. And as you're saying, fewer tickets being sold, but events getting more expensive. Aurelia, I would love to hear how, from the management side, how are you and your teams and your artists kind of designing events, knowing that people are willing to pay more, but they're going to go out less?
Yeah, so indeed, there's a change through the years into that. We clearly notice that people are ready to pay more for bigger events, meaning like bigger production, having this kind of immersive experience. So we see in the different markets that also our partners on the ground, they really want to develop different tiers. Also, for example, all this backstage experience, VIP experience, VVIP experiences. So this is a new thing in the business. And indeed, I think, as you mentioned, less tickets sold, but more expensive, which is great for a side of the business. It gives a lot of possibilities for production, for bringing bigger lineup, so to please really younger crowd and also maybe more experienced crowd. But obviously, these are a reverse side with maybe clubs suffering more and more in our industry. And this is maybe also a question that is not so nice, because I think for the younger crowd, this can be a kind of a gap, you know, and they cannot fill.
Right. So how do you satisfy fans who want to go out, but they're not able to purchase VIP or VVIP experiences?
I mean, I would say, like, in general, obviously we need to adapt to also what people want, but there is a reflection, I think, that we could have in terms of like trying to fill a bit that gap. So there will be actually some kind of experiences that could also be not that expensive. And I think there's a reflection here because everything went really fast. And well, you know, it's always nice to take a step back and think about how we can make it further and keep our scene also very accessible for younger crowd, but also people with less economic possibilities, especially with the context of our world. I think we need to think about that a lot.
Yeah, I wonder, Mark, if that relates to, as you really brought the point home about scenes and electronic music coming from, you know, authentic underground places. How are, I guess, say more about that, and then how it feeds people being able to kind of go out more locally, and how it feeds kind of like thriving local cultures.
Yeah, so I think there's this really, really big thing that happened quick enough for it to mean that the world is dramatically different now than it was 10 years ago, but slow enough for us to not realize it's happening. And that is, if you think about how every bit of our lives, particularly our digital lives, are, first of all the apps we open on a phone are American apps, and the mentality of the investors has flown through to the algorithm. Everybody's got to be big. Everybody's got to be global. Everybody's got to do it really quickly. Number of likes and everything is what counts, rather than what is at the essence of it. And I think we've all got caught up in that sort of system. You know, every creator and everyone else is, I've got to post all the time, I've got to get big, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and, you know, Ben mentioned at the start about, you know, we're beginning to get, you know, to more and more venues, you know, sort of getting stickers on phones or leave the phone at the door, et cetera. So we're beginning to see sort of a pushback against it. It's like, how do we ensure that culture isn't simply content for the machine? You know, and it's the, I think that is maybe one of the things where just because it isn't online doesn't mean it's important. You know, that's sort of one of the things where it's like, if it's not got loads of likes, loads of views, then did it happen? And I think the more that electronic music can lean into, if you weren't there, nobody knows about it apart from you. And I think that specialness of, you know, when I was a, you know, raver in the late 90s, it was like, you go to these like dark, sweaty clubs. What happened in the club stayed in the club. Nobody was photographing it, and you know, you maybe had a few hazy memories of it the next day, and that was it. And it was more special for it.
Right. I wonder, you mentioned the kind of crucial nature of SoundCloud and the development of scenes. And tell me about why that platform is so important to the kind of creation of the communities that you're talking about.
So I think there's a really big important thing, which is SoundCloud is sound, right? It's not.
It starts with that.
Yeah. And so it's never going to play the entire role in a way that Instagram plays, you know. So what it becomes a window into these scenes. Those scenes can't express themselves fully in there because they don't have video and everything else. So that's one of the reasons I think it becomes important. The other is because of where it came from, right? You know, the original founders founded it to be able to share demos more easily. So it's always come from like within the sort of the creative environment. And it's a place which is just about music. You know, you think Spotify's no longer just about music, it's about audiobooks and podcasts as well. And, you know, and everywhere you look, you find very few places that are purely about music. So I think that idea that it is only sound and it's only about music and that it leans heavily into the creator community, those are really its three superpowers.
Yeah. Finlay, I'm wondering how the report and what in the report stands out from you from an AFEM perspective and kind of the concerns and anxieties of the community that you represent in that respect.
Sure. I mean, as a trade association, I think we're very happy when artists get amazing A-level success. But I think our core principle is we want more people making a sustainable living through electronic music and culture and in a safe and healthy way. That's the kind of fundamental mission. And part of the kind of pattern that's outlined in the report is that there is a gap in the middle. You don't have the middle class of artists. You don't then have middle classes of teams around them, middle class of promoters. And that's the section that I think we need to focus on growing. I think a lot of, me and Mark talked about it earlier, we use GDP to measure, what the health of a country, but actually with a very rich population, that skews it. And we want, I think, more artists making a living if they choose to through dance music culture. And that's the part that I think we need to focus on. And the other big, for me, the purpose of the report is an action plan for the audience. So if you're sat there and you don't have a strategy for Brazil or Indonesia, or you don't know anyone from those countries, for me, that's the action point, because it's important to remember the report as a reflection of what's just been, not necessarily what's going to happen next year. So now is the time to act on those findings and build that strategy.
Just one build on that. So has anybody here heard of the term of a K-shaped economy? And not that type of K, or the letter K. No, right. So a K-shaped economy is when everybody at the top is doing really well, sentiment's doing really well, and everybody else is going down. So it creates that sort of K-shape. I think there's a risk that we're getting there with the music and with electronic music. Superstars are doing all their Instagrams and playing the biggest festivals and whatever else. And the average DJ is thinking, how do I get going? Because the small clubs aren't open anymore. And, and how do I get the algorithm to hear me? To your point about, and that leaves just a gap where the middle should be.
Yes, I think this gap is within the music artist, within the artist, but also within the audience, right? As we said, with like the different ticket and also this dynamic ticketing. So the gap is like everywhere in both sides. So.
Right. In terms of action, as you said, based on what we're seeing in the report, are you guys seeing any areas that are, represented in the report where you're like, okay, well, people could do this, that, or the other thing to kind of create that middle class or boost that middle class that we're talking about?
I think it's a multitude of things. One of the very early slides in Mark, we talked about merch, the ancillary rights, all of that, thinking about your artistry in a 360 way and not just focus on what are my streams or Instagram views. That then becomes the model, I think. And also looking at the fact that we want more people doing it for the love of it. As long as you're creating music and doing it for the love of it, the success will come with hard work naturally. And I think it's important that we have a level of engagement from artists that are doing it for the love. And I think, I believe that culture is kind of like a river. You can steer it slightly, but you can't stop it. It's going to go where it wants to go. And we've got to build, I think, a framework where you've got the best chance of grabbing it and running with it, should you choose to do that.
Sure. I was really interested in what you said about catalog sales, and I'm curious the unique opportunities within electronic music catalogs and how you see these being more valuable, or the value being different than other genres?
Yeah. So the first big mover in the catalog space was Hypnosis, and anybody who reads the music trade press knows that they've been through a colourful few years. But their starting point, when Merck was founding it originally, he wasn't planning on buying old catalogues. He was planning on buying catalogues of artists who are still current now, but had maybe like 5 or so years behind them. They ended up shifting away from that because the first time they had a ratings agency, the sort of people who basically tell the investment community how valuable that company is, they didn't give them the full grade because they were saying, because it's, they don't have all the Bob Dylans and everything else. So he ended up switching a bit more that way. And the big institutional money that came in to begin with, these aren't music industry people. These are pension funds. They're asset managers, and they're looking at it as an asset. And most of them were white older men who invested in music by white older men. And, and because it felt like a safe bet. But then they started realizing, but those older people aren't really streaming much. So actually you need to go after the younger audiences, and electronic music is just inherently a younger culture. It's been around less time, and it's constantly, constant, turnover of new artists. So it's easier to get something that's culturally relevant, but the superpower is remixing, because remixing can make a track from 10 years ago a Beatport #1 today, and it becomes part of today's culture. Whereas if we re-release a Oasis special edition, sort of what's the story, it's still, you're buying a museum piece, whereas a remix makes it today.
So there's opportunities to create new IP.
Yeah.
That other genres don't.
I would say, yeah, it is new IP, but I would say more importantly, it's new culture.
Understood. Okay, thanks for that. Also, I remember you saying this in the report last year, but maybe you feel like things have gotten acutely worse, but the world is a challenging place, as we all know. And I'm really interested in this phenomenon of, as you said in the report, sounds becoming harder, people gravitating towards these hard sounds when the world is difficult. Talk about that phenomenon and just how electronic music kind of fits into what's happening in the world at large right now.
Well, personally, I love it. I love Schranz and hard techno, so it's all good for me. But no, I think it's you think about, the original rise of, sort of dubstep, various different things have come, they reflect, they're like a mirror of the world going on around us. You look back in wider music when punk came in the late 70s, and as a reaction against, you had Gulf crises back then in the 70s, whatever. Music has always been a way where people who are otherwise powerless to change the world around them can express themselves through music. The difference is these days is like when punk was getting going, they had to work out a way to get media to pay attention. Now in the days of the algorithm serving it straight to the person, it becomes much more led by the people. So I think it's much more of us like producers, DJs and promoters are leaning in to the demand from audiences, but you're probably going to know way more about that than me.
No, I do not.
Okay.
I'm wondering on a pragmatic level how you're seeing, Aurelia, maybe this is a good question for you, kind of the trickle-down effect of the war and transportation disruption, and how this is affecting not just artist touring, but also fan behavior.
I think indeed everybody starts to be quite concerned about that. As you know, so a phenomenon like political phenomenon happened, and then the repercussion comes after a certain pair of months. And as we're in Ibiza, I believe Ibiza is a market where we are all very concerned about what's going to happen because, of course, of the flight cost. And in general, people, of course, having, more problem with inflation. So for, like, let's say the regular GA customer, there is definitely a big question here. So I believe that our industry here in Ibiza is a bit like thinking, okay, we might have more problem with the GA, but actually the VIP might come more because it's a kind of a safe place for some people also from the Middle East. So we are here, of course, waiting to understand a little bit better. But indeed, I think there is definitely question to think of. And also to add on, I think also the clubs here for this year already are thinking of having GA tickets lower than last year. And I think it was interesting in your report, you were saying in 2025, there were less events, but higher tickets. And I believe that 2026, we are looking at more events and less expensive. So the market can react quite fast. And I think this is important.
Yeah, I just want to do a quick buzzkill on the thing about flights. So you might be thinking, well, we all managed to get here, the tickets were affordable and whatever else. The way that airlines buy the fuel, they hedge. So what they do is they basically say, we're going to bet the price in 6 months' time is going to be X. We're going to buy a fuel at that price now. That's locked in. So even though the cost of aviation fuel is going up, most of the airlines are still running off the old prices. So it will be a sudden change. It's going to be a bit like, do you remember COVID? Where it's like, oh, you see all these news reports, more and more infections, and then suddenly, bang, it's lockdown. You know, it's like, and I think unless things change, we're going to have a sort of a lockdown type moment where suddenly it hits.
Do you think that the VIPs, VVIPs, are kind of in a place where they can subsidize the fans? And, you know, as you're saying, these tickets are going to become more expensive for VIPs and lower for fans. Does that create kind of safety, given that these people are always going to have disposable income?
I think there are two different things, because when you say VIP, maybe you think in terms of club is like tables. Okay, so this is like really, really very rich people, if we can say so. But then in let's say festivals, you call like a VIP ticket, which is a bit more expensive ticket where you have access to maybe better toilet, better bars. So actually there's also a kind of a lot of differences. So this concept can also be to favorize a better experience for also consumers that are not extremely rich. But what we can think is, like, for example, in an ecosystem like Ibiza, obviously the table money is helping to develop the production in the club and to keep the tickets for the GA at a reasonable price. And we are still very reasonable. If you look at the ticket in the US to go to a club, it's rarely under $150, like a GA. So we are still, I think, here making a good job into keeping this affordable. But yeah, we have always to be very careful and be very reactive.
The worry that I have is most people here are in it for the long haul. And I think what happens in 5 years' time, because if the current generation are maybe priced out of clubbing or not going, by the time they get a good, well-paying job in 5 years' time, they've not gone up the club culture. They may choose to spend their VIP money in some other way.
Yeah.
So VIP is not a forever thing. It's right now and it is what it is. But I think if you're interested in building a 10-year career in music, that's not a horse to bet on, because I think that could easily change in terms of what they see as being worthwhile and what the culture represents them as well.
Yeah, so I think it's worth looking at what's happened at football, particularly in England, where it's been this hyper-commercialization. There has never been more money in the game. Players are getting paid more than ever. You know, Saudi Arabia is buying teams. You know, it's just, you know, it's never, from a revenue and commercial performance perspective, it's never been better. But the tickets are becoming so less affordable that the crowds are changing. So you've got loads of VIPs, but you've also got lots of well-to-do people. So many Premiership games, it's like, you know, polite clapping and whatever else, which is not what football crowds are about. And I think the same applies to dance music. If you don't have the kids going nuts on the dance floor, you haven't got a proper vibe.
How does that relate to one of the major themes, which is the rise of the global south and these scenes that you're seeing, as you're saying, in Indonesia and, you know, so on and so forth?
So we were talking about how, you know, sort of club nights are suffering where more people are going to events, right? That's because in the West, electronic music has its roots in the dance floor. But in a country like in Indonesia, you know, a fairly strict Muslim country, you're not getting much in the way of club culture. It's coming from a different place. So I think, you know, and that's just one example. So I think, you know, the electronic music scenes, there are, you know, big festivals that the DJs go and tour and whatever else, but it's coming from a different place, you know, and I wouldn't put a value judgment on that one way or another. It's just understanding it's not coming from where Western electronic music came.
Another example is China. China has zero club culture, but have a huge festival culture now, and everything goes through that. And the festivals are very spread different music, you know, and our electronic music artist starts to come into the market only through the festivals, not through the club scenes.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. How do artists capitalize and sort of insert themselves into these spaces where club culture isn't as relevant as it is here?
I mean, I think for the more established artists, it's less an issue. You know, it's more the younger artists that have issues because to not have this club culture to build their first steps. But for the more established artists nowadays, I think obviously we have more and more electronic artists in the top 100 festivals. So yeah, from VAC Festival in Shanghai, Rock on Set in Paris, or of course now where we're at Coachella. Yeah. And I think 12 years ago, Coachella had just one little tent with electronic music artists, and it was not always full. And as you saw, Katie, this weekend, every stage is full of electronic music artists with even Anima headlining the main stage. So that's a big difference, which is very interesting because we are coming to a brighter audience. As we also discussed that sometimes we live in a microcosm with our feed and we think that, everything is happening, but it's only here. Obviously, going into those big audiences is important. But I think it should still be balanced with reviving the club scene.
I think it's also important to separate out cause and effect. Right, just seeing loads of DJ lineups and more people in the the dance tent or they're on the main stage or whatever else. If you look at culture as a whole, more people are into more things, right? And they're less deeply into things. I always sort of think about when I grew up, basically I liked a few artists, loads, and I just got all of their stuff. Now, so if old school music was basically a series of monogamous relationships, music's now become Tinder. Everybody's, and so what that means is festivals really good because you're not just going to pay for one artist. It's loads of artists you quite like, loads of DJs you quite like. And that's good in terms of you've got the numbers, but the actual deep roots of when the spotlight moves on, just like in the EDM craze, when the spotlight moved on, it's like, well, suddenly a whole load of the audience suddenly became hip hop fans.
Yes.
And we're out of time. Any final thoughts you guys want to add before we wrap it up?
No, so thank you for having us. And I think we are still very lucky to be in a growing industry and we have many more years together. So that's great.
Okay. Thank you guys for your insights.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.